The three locks. To understand the break, start with the three locks that kept the dollar on the high ground and the crews already testing new keys. Lock 1, payment control. Not the app on your phone, the plumbing under it. For decades, Swift messaging, New York clearing, and correspondent chains formed a narrow canyon. Visibility gave leverage. OFAC lists traveled faster than ships. Banks from Lagos to Busan routed through a few windows, so one click could strand cash mid-ocean. That worked because routes were few and everyone feared the yellow light turning red. Lock 2, commodity pricing. Oil in dollars, freight financed in dollar credit, and insurance written by P&I clubs in places that listened when Washington or London called. Brent and WTI told you the price. Letters of credit told you the rules. Insurers told you whether a pilot would even board. Move crude, grain, metals. Move through dollar benchmarks and Western protection. Lock 3, reserves and custody. Surpluses parked in treasuries, Eurodollars fueled global credit, and safekeeping sat in Euroclear and Clearstream. You saved in dollars because depth lived there, market makers answered, and storms had a hotline. The Fed swapped lines. Safety felt like procedure, not belief. Then the hinges loosened. After Crimea in the 2010s, Russia built SPFS, a domestic messaging spine with foreign adapters. In the mid-2010, China launched CIPS for cross-border yuan. Between the late 2010s and early 2020s, local currency swap lines thickened. Oil for yuan pilots ran, and banks learned dual scripts. In parallel, Moscow and Beijing explicitly coordinated to stitch SPFS and CIPS together, so a payment could route across both without touching Western windows, exactly the kind of workaround their officials previewed after 2014. In 2022, a G20 central bank's reserves were immobilized. Custody turned into policy, and Treasury memos changed tone. If an asset can be frozen, it's not savings, it's leverage. Breakers went in by corridor. CIPS and SPFS gained translation layers. When one tunnel flagged enhanced due diligence, traffic repacked and moved. BRICS banks ceded trade credit without a dollar touch. Regional lenders offered local currency settlement. The BIS-led mBridge pilots, China, UAE, Thailand, HKMA, proved atomic settlement across CBDCs. 2 FX legs land at the same instant, final on arrival, no Western jurisdiction in the path. Software is one leg, hardware is the other. Power of Siberia turned strategy into steel, a 3,000-kilometer line moving Siberian gas directly into Chinese grids, a physical link the research called out as the backbone of the partnership. It made winter flow a fact and priced risk in uptime, not sea lanes. Shadow fleets, alt insurers, and discount math kept barrels moving despite price caps. Meanwhile, vault policies shifted. Central banks accumulated gold aggressively. Custody moved home. Bars migrated from London good delivery to kilo formats that travel Asia's arteries. Shanghai premiums told you when physical was tight. Open Loop, a gold-weighted settlement unit under quiet test, a basket that nets trade in national currencies and reconciles drift with metal on a schedule. Not a coin, a yardstick. Energy first, then bulk commodities. CRI&K corridors show the sanctions-proof edge. The wider BRICS web shows the mainstream. Inside those lanes, the no-limits language from February 2022 isn't just rhetoric. It's visible in exercise schedules, pipeline volumes, and payment routes that default to SPFS. CIPS when pressure rises. 3 locks, 3 sets of picks. Payment rails with failovers. Pricing that references new benches. Reserves hedged with metal in domestic vaults. While New York perfected compliance dashboards, someone else wrote the fallback clause and taught treasurers which button to press when the light turns yellow. The dollar's high ground, how control worked. To see why the picks matter, we need to walk the hill the dollar built, plumbing, habits, and guardrails that felt like gravity. Start with oil. In the 1970s, producers agreed to price crude in dollars, and a loop snapped into place. Exporters took greenbacks, bought U.S. treasuries, and parked savings inside the deepest market on Earth. Those surpluses flowed back, keeping borrowing cheap and liquid. Offshore dollars, Eurodollars, financed everything from Sao Paulo factories to Seoul shipyards. A Nigerian cargo, a Korean refinery, a Brazilian loan, all settled in dollars because the rails were smooth and the exit doors always open. Visibility gave those rails teeth. Swift didn't move money. It moved the messages that told banks what to do. If you saw the messages, you saw the routes. Pair that with New York clearing and long correspondent chains, and Washington could reach into an Indian Ocean charter or a Baltic shipyard without a U.S. entity on the invoice. OFAC didn't send troops. It sent lists. Compliance teams from Rotterdam to Riyadh read those lists and said no. Primary sanctions told U.S. persons what not to touch. Secondary sanctions told everyone else what might happen if they tried. The eurodollar world magnified that reach. Dollars created outside the United States still settled through windows that answered to U.S. rules. A Singapore desk could write a dollar swap with a Turkish bank at 2 a.m., but when the waterfall hit New York, any flagged node stopped the flow. Meanwhile, custody kept sovereign savings tidy. Euroclear and Clearstream held the receipts. Tri-party repo desks turned treasuries into overnight cash. Central banks slept because collateral was pristine and markets were bottomless. If storms hit, the Federal Reserve opened swap lines to allies and the tide lifted boats. After 2008, emergency facilities made privilege feel like a hotline. Shipping turned policy into paperwork. Most blue water risk sat inside mutual clubs, the P&I insurers domiciled where calls from Washington or London mattered. If a cargo needed cover, the rules traveled with the policy. Maritime compliance became a gate at the harbor mouth. Oil benchmarks, Brent, WTI, set price. The financing behind those barrels drew on dollar credit. You didn't just buy oil, you bought the legal and financial scaffold around it. If that scaffold withdrew, ships stalled offshore, letters of credit died in inboxes, and pilots waited for instructions. The 2000s tightened the mesh. Patriot Act rules pulled KYC and AML into daily banking. Banks built towers of compliance, stacking watch lists into dashboards. Then the 2008 crisis rewired the emergency circuits. When funding froze, the Fed swap lines became global oxygen. Dollars rushed to Europe and Japan. Commercial paper unfroze. The world relearned that dollar liquidity was the fire hose you wanted when engines failed. Exorbitant privilege stopped being a slogan and became a workflow. But listen to the fine print. Every added lever, more designations, bigger fines, told boardrooms and ministries that the currency came with policy strings. That was tolerable when the rules felt predictable. Crimea added a warning. In 2022, immobilizing a G20 central bank's reserves crossed a line. That wasn't a normal sanction, that was custody becoming a lever. The old promise, that reserves were beyond the storm, looked conditional. Sovereigns asked their treasurers a hard question. What's safe if the safe can be switched off? There was another cost, quieter but relentless. Dollar dominance exported U.S. monetary choices. When the Fed hiked to tame inflation, screws tightened in Lagos, Lahore, and Lima. Debt priced in dollars grew heavier each tick. That dependency felt different when financial warfare moved from banks to central banks. If the toolset can scale from a lender to a sovereign, the calculus changes from efficiency to autonomy. Micro stakes made it human. A captain didn't need a U.S. stamp on his manifest to feel American power. He needed insurance. He needed a letter of credit from a bank that wanted New York access. He needed a port agent whose compliance team wouldn't risk a fine because one refiner on the itinerary touched a sanctioned counterparty last quarter. Control looked like paperwork, but it acted like a gate. Miss the gate, Miss Payroll. So the high ground was a stack, not a throne. Pricing in dollars set the stage. Messaging and clearing controlled movement. Insurance and custody kept risk manageable. Swap lines calmed panic. And sanctions, primary and secondary, turned tools into deterrence. For decades, it worked because the rails were faster, the markets deeper, and the storms survivable. The network effect fed itself. Use dollars because everyone else does. Park reserves where sellers always wait. Submit to the rules because the alternative is cost and delay. The trade-off at the core finally surfaced. Stability in exchange for discretion. Liquidity in exchange for compliance. When a major sovereign saw its savings turned inert, the balance shifted. The question stopped being, is there an alternative? It became, how much redundancy do we need before we can say no? That's when the first new pipes went in quietly under headlines that still assumed the hill couldn't be climbed. The break point, 2014 to 2022. 3 days after Crimea, a Moscow banker sat in a glass tower watching screens that no longer obeyed him. Payments that used to sing through New York slowed, then failed. Lines he never noticed, correspondence, clearers, compliance filters turned into walls. That week, the assumption that the hill couldn't be climbed died. The plan wasn't a speech, it was a wiring diagram. Sanctions in 2014 were more than fines, they were a systems test. Dollar funding tightened for Russian banks. Export letters of credit arrived with new caveats. A refinery in Omsk watched a parts shipment rerouted twice, then canceled because a supplier's parent didn't like the heat. Swift's visibility made every detour obvious. Touch a flagged node, the light went yellow. Persist, and it went red. So Russia built redundancy. The System for Transfer of Financial Messages, SPFS, started as a domestic messenger, then grew adapters so foreign banks could reach ruble payments without US windows. At first, it looked provincial. Engineers kept writing, gateways multiplied. By the late 2010s, most internal traffic could keep moving even if the main road shut. Elegance didn't matter, uptime did. Across the border, China took careful notes. In 2015, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, went live. If you want yuan to work for trade, you need rails under it. Banks across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa attached. Corridors formed quietly. The first energy invoices in yuan were small, controlled, and settled fast. Traders saw the habit forming, a lane that didn't ask New York for permission. Between 2017 and 2019, soft infrastructure clicked into place. Local currency swap lines thickened. Trade desks wrote dual-term sheets, one in dollars, one in yuan or rubles, with counterparty preference in the margin. A West Asian state oil firm tested partial yuan settlement on a spot cargo, then a term flow. The motive wasn't ideology. It was options that cleared. Interoperability arrived as a bag of adapters, not a single switch. Message translation mapped SPFS formats to ISO 20022 on CIPS and legacy MT fields. If one leg stalled, routers repacked the payload and tried another tunnel. Banks built routing trees, primary through Swift for low-risk flows, secondary through CIPS or SPFS for sensitive legs, human overrides for edge cases. Redundancy became muscle memory. Then 2022 tore the veil. A group of 20 central banks' foreign reserves were immobilized. Ministries around the world pulled up custody maps. A deputy governor in Southeast Asia put a finger on a box labeled Euroclear and asked, "What exactly do we own?" In Moscow and Beijing, the answer had already taken shape. Route sensitive flows over SPFS and CIPS, settle energy in national currencies, and keep building the joint playbook the research called a direct response to sanctions. Gold stopped being a romance. Jurisdiction started to matter more than yield. Checklists changed first. Reserve managers were weighted toward home-held assets. Bars moved from European chains into domestic vaults. Import licenses for kilobars accelerated. Shanghai premiums ran hot on tight weeks, telling you where stress lived. Banks edited basis assumptions that treated dollar funding as frictionless. Risk models added corridors as variables. Non-aligned states hedged with intent. A finance minister in Africa demanded dual-rail banking, one global bank for Western lanes, one regional bank tied to CIPS. A South Asian refinery split insurance between a traditional P&I club and a Gulf underwriter. Letters of credit added clauses naming alternative rails in case of disruption. That phrase crept into dozens of contracts and stayed. The hardware kept pace. Power of Siberia moved gas beneath mountains where destroyers can't patrol. Port concessions ringed the Indian Ocean with friendly docks for friendly ships. A shadow fleet of older tankers, muted transponders, and renamed cargoes delivered barrels insured by new clubs. Discounts bought independence from certain phone calls. The barrel burned the same. The money found other routes. Digital experiments matured. Central banks stepped into the BIS sandbox. Project mBridge proved atomic settlement, two legs of foreign exchange locking in the same ledger tick, with China's PBOC, the HKMA, the UAE, and Thailand in the core. Fees fell because hops vanished. Timelines shrank because correspondence disappeared. Daylight overdrafts turned into a design choice. For treasurers, certainty beat charm. Boardrooms absorbed the lesson in one sentence. We're not leaving the dollar, we're adding exits. Corporates kept dollar balance sheets for debt, but they rehearsed. A metals trader in Shanghai ran a small cargo through yuan settlement and wrote down which screens blinked. A Turkish importer paid a Russian supplier in rubles 1 month, yuan the next, and marked which forms changed. Drills became policy. Politics pushed, but math sealed habits. Freezes reframed risk. Buy treasuries for safety turned into assume the issuer won't object to your policy. Some could live with that, others needed insurance. Gold provided one kind, alternative rails provided another. Local currency swaps were a third. No single button could darken the room. By late 2022, the break wasn't a headline, it was a workflow. Routes had more lines, insurers had more names. Settlement screens offered choices. Nothing looked revolutionary on paper. Everything felt different at 3 a.m. when someone asked, "Can we move this without asking permission?" Increasingly, yes, if you take the other road. The parallel rails, CIPS, SPFS, and Interop. Unknown to them across town, a small branch banker was learning a new login screen. The banner didn't say SWIFT, it said CIPS. Same fields, counterparty, amount, purpose, code, but one quiet line at the bottom read, "Final under Chinese law." That line explained the second monitor on a lot of desks. CIPS wasn't a shiny consumer app. It was a backbone built to move cross-border yuan with its own messaging and settlement under the People's Bank of China's window. By the early 2020s, direct participants anchored in Shanghai, indirects linked through larger banks, correspondent routes reached into Southeast Asia, the Gulf, and parts of Africa. Interfaces mirrored global habits, ISO 20022 fields, MT lookalikes, so ops didn't need a new dictionary. Screening lists existed, just tuned to Chinese statutes, not OFAC's reach. Across the border, SPFS carried Russia's domestic traffic and built gateways for outsiders who needed ruble reach without New York's visibility. It started parochial, then grew pragmatic. Foreign banks parked adapters in ring-fenced subsidiaries so legal risk couldn't jump fences. It never pretended to be global. It promised uptime when other pipes flickered. Here, where engineering turned policy into practice. Interoperability wasn't one big switch. It was a bin full of adapters, exactly the SPFS, CIPS stitching the research described after 2014. Translation layers mapped SPFS formats to ISO 20022 on CIPS and to legacy MT fields where clients still lived. If a message tripped enhanced due diligence on one rail, routers repackaged the payload and tried the other. Banks set routing trees, green lanes through SWIFT for vanilla trade, secondary lanes through CIPS or SPFS for sensitive corridors, human overrides for edge cases. Failovers moved from slide decks to muscle memory. Regional adoption made it normal. In Central Asia, mid-sized lenders added CIPS access for China-bound invoices while keeping SWIFT for Europe. Gulf banks connected to CIPS to settle yuan oil receipts with fewer questions and smaller fees. A handful experimented with SPFS for Black Sea cargoes, small sizes first, then term flows once the lawyers stopped sweating. Each new corridor lowered the social cost of hitting the non-dollar button. Speed mattered, but predictability mattered more. CIPS cut correspondent hops and shaved hours off settlement. It wasn't always faster on clean Western lanes, but it was consistently fast enough and less prone to policy ripples. Fee schedules rewarded repeat counterparties and steady corridors. Compliance ecosystems formed in parallel. KYC vendors under Chinese law, audit trails regulators accepted locally, screening libraries that didn't mirror Washington word for word. Not lax, aligned elsewhere. Legal scaffolding followed money. Contracts added annexes naming alternative rails, fallback currencies, and where disputes landed if settlement skipped SWIFT. Arbitration shifted. Singapore or Hong Kong appeared where London used to sit. Insurance mirrored the pivot. Regional underwriters wrote policies that looked like P&I wording, answered to regional courts, and recognized corridor benchmarks tied to delivery points east of Suez. Captains didn't learn doctrine. They learned which paper got a tugboat. Meanwhile, ops teams practiced like firefighters. Quarterly drills ran blackouts, flipped descriptors to accurate but boring, switch rail priority, confirm receipt on the backup. Dashboards showed live corridor health, green for CIPS windows open, yellow for SWIFT delay notices, blue for SPFS retries. A treasurer learned to glance at those colors as often as Brent quotes. Micro stakes told the story. A factory finance lead in Karachi had two identical invoices,